Hi, everyone, and welcome to the March webinar for the Virtual Pre-Service Teacher Network. And I'm April Forts, and I'm the State Supervisor of Mathematics at the Iowa Department of Education. And so for this month's webinar, we are looking at communicating reasoning claims, instructional implications using standards for mathematical practices 3 and 6, and the instructional implications using them with principles to action. So on the recordings slide that I navigated to by clicking on recordings over here, under that tab, you'll see that we have several tools here for you. We do include the slide deck. We also will start with the Iowa Core Standards and Instruction to Assessment Target Alignment Guide, and then we'll look at the 8 effective teaching practices. Even if you're watching this as a recorded webinar, I would encourage you to go in and take the survey. I value feedback very much, and I read it all and I try to make the changes because I too am a continuous learner and want to increase my skill set to be able to provide better webinars and information for the pre-service teachers. So I'm just going to open a couple of things so that we have them ready. And then we'll get started. So I'm going to start with our slide deck. And so the first thing is I took an inventory in the slide deck of who had attended previous sessions and what they found was useful and what they still needed to support on. If this is your first webinar, I would greatly encourage you to go back and watch our previous ones where we talked about the overall tools that are available through the Iowa Department of Education for mathematics in the areas of instruction, assessment, and professional development. I also would encourage you to, and that is in November's. December's was about the content targets, and so I would also encourage you to watch that because with the standards for mathematical practices, we always embed the content into the standards for mathematical practices. A common question I get is which standards of mathematical practices align to which content standards? And when we're thinking about the standards for mathematical practices, we want to start with those and think about what content is appropriate to embed into those different practices. And so we'll talk about that here and the tools that you can use to guide those decisions. And then we skipped January because you all were on winter break. And then in February, we picked up with the standards for mathematical practices around problem solving, 1, 5, 7, and 8. So then today we're going to be talking about communicating reasoning, and we're going to talk about standards for mathematical practices 3 and 6. Now, even though our tools on the website are listed under the assessment, there's a reason for that, because we should be assessing what we're instructing. And even though Smarter Balance is currently on pause, we know that 50% of the country gives an assessment that's Smarter Balance or PARC, and many of the other states give an assessment that is similar to Smarter Balance and PARC. So the authors of the standards who wrote the standards for math and the standards for mathematical practices did a bunch of work across the nation with national experts and work teams, and they've done progression documents and coherence maps and this work around assessment. And so we know that these resources are aligned. So even though the scope is Smarter Balance, we can still use those resources to understand how we can implement the standards for mathematical practices at higher depths of knowledge in our classroom. So, but our focus is always on instruction. And so since 50% or more of the country are giving assessments that are aligned to these rigorous, focused, and coherent content standards and standards for mathematical practices, then we also want our students in Iowa, even though we don't give that assessment, we know those other states are using those rigorous the rigorous curriculum for their students. And our students in Iowa are global students. they're going to go out and go to colleges and compete against the students in the other states. And we want our students to have those rigorous educational experiences around mathematics also. So it's not about a test, it's about how do we use this information to really focus our instruction. So we have several classroom resources, and so the characteristics of the assessment targets, and if you've not watched a previous webinar, then you can think about assessment targets are the same as your clusters and your standards. And so we have documents that list the domains, the targets, the standards, the DOKs, which are your depth of knowledge, vertical alignments, achievement levels, evidence required, vocabulary, response types, materials, attributes, question types, and question banks. Now, what I love about having all this information available is we don't have to spend our time focusing on generating all this information, right? We can just focus on the thing that we know makes the most difference in the classroom, which is the teacher having good instruction and those students having good mathematical experiences. And that's really where we're going to see students increase their understanding and be more college and career ready. Because we know from the research, the more mathematical understanding students have, then that decreases the chance that they will end up in poverty or homeless or in prison committing crimes, and none of us want that for our little ones, right? We all want them to be awesome. So while I'll share this information with you, I also have to say as a disclaimer, none of this information should be interpreted as a requirement, right? Because we are local control states. So from the Iowa Department of Education, we do not require or mandate certain things, and we allow those decisions to be made within the school districts, and because you know your students. And at the same time, remember, it is all standards for all students. Another reason that I offer this virtual network is because I want to identify those up and coming leaders. Some of you have natural leadership abilities and you're going to be teacher leaders in the classroom. Others of you are going to develop that. And I want to know who you are now, because as you're working in the classroom and you're doing these amazing things, I want to know and be able to connect so that we can connect other educators across the state. So if you are not on my emailing list, or if you're getting ready to graduate, please give me an email address that I can follow up, and I can move you to the Teachers Network or to the Coaches Network. And I just want to stay in contact with you so I can continue to help support you. So then we just talked about how many districts across the state of Iowa have done work around priority, unpacking, essential, power standards, etc. And again, we're local control that we can make those decisions, but we should be using aligned resources to help guide our practice so that we can make the best instructional decisions for our students. And it's a lot easier, I always feel, like to edit something than it is to create it from scratch. So we're going to talk about a lot of tools that you can use to do that work once you get into your districts. So again, we have previously talked about the content standards and problem solving, and today we're going to talk about communicating reasoning. I'm going to share a couple other slides with you before we jump in, just so then we can be done with the slides and we don't have to come back. So we do have standard-based grading rubrics on the website, and we will talk about those in depth in an upcoming webinar, but those again are great resources that you can use. There's a practice test. I would encourage you to take the practice test so that you can see how rigorous these assessments are. And in order for students to achieve at these levels, our instruction is really going to have to be rigorous, and it's going to have to be focused on those mathematical shifts of focus, coherent, and rigor. So we also have a G+ community. So I would invite you to connect, to go ahead and join that, and that way you can stay part of the community even after you graduate. And I also have communities for other educational groups, so you can join that as well. We have an upcoming ICTM Save the Date in October 9th, 2017. We'll have many exciting sessions, Principles to Action, Growth Mindset. We're just hoping to get really great presenters. And as a last thing, we are having a June professional development. And if you're going to be in the Des Moines area and you want to attend, or if you get positioned at a school, if you're graduating and you're going to get a job, connect with the school district and see if you can attend with them. But these Principles to Action are actually 6 principles, and we focus on the first principle of the teaching and learning. And within that teaching and learning, there are 8 effective mathematical practices that are at the core of our instruction. And if we do nothing else well, these are the things we want to do well. And we'll talk more about these in depth. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and open this Iowa Core Standards to Instruction document, and then we won't go back to the slides. So one of the reasons why we made this tool, or this guide, was because we put a lot of information that districts and teachers can use to guide their instructional decisions. And it was so much information that we needed a little sort of guidebook to walk them through. And so we did that. And part 1, again, was the content standards. And this is a little table of contents up here. So now remember that you can always pause this recording, right, and go back and listen to it, or pause and go check something out. So I know that I'm going fast in the recording, but when we meet online during the webinar, we go a little bit slower. We try to make it more interactive. So then part 2 is those problem solving targets around standards for mathematical practices 1, 5, 7, and 8. And the next part is around communicating reasoning. So I'm going to go ahead and select that header, and it brings me down to aligning the standards for mathematical practices. So in claim 3, or what we call communicating reasoning, students can clearly and precisely construct viable arguments to support their own reasoning and critique the reasoning of others. This by far is my most favorite topic, because I feel that this topic right here, communicating reasoning, transcends all of the content. I feel this is the thing that connects us. We can talk about anything, and our arguments, and they're not really arguments, but we don't want to just be blind sheep and just follow everyone else, right? We want to say, hey, does that really make sense? And can I defend this, right? Just like when attorneys in a court of law, they have to be able to defend it, right? And we should be able to do that. Construct viable arguments means defending our own reasoning, right? And critique the reasoning of others. So it refers to recurring themes in the content and practice standards. The ability to construct and present clear, logical, convincing arguments. For older students, this may take the form of rigorous, deductive proof based on clearly stated axioms. For younger students, this will involve more informal justification. The assessment task that address this claim will typically present a claim and then ask the students to provide for an example, a justification, or a counterexample, right? So we can say, hey, this thing worked 100 times, but if one time it doesn't work, then that would be the counterexample, right? So then that would be part of our reasoning. So we're going to look at standards for mathematical practices 3 and 6. And again, 3 is construct viable arguments and critique the reasoning of others. And 6 is to attend to precision. And if we go back up here, you'll see that we want to clearly and precisely. So that's where the precision comes in. So now this document walks you through a screenshot. We will actually go to the Iowa Core site and look at this live, but this kind of just gives you a way to walk through it and to go back to it later on. So it says to go to the assessment target page on the Iowa Core website, and it will look like this. So you're going to have grade 3 targets, and we talked about those a little bit. And then we're going to open up the grade 3 targets. So if you select on that grade 3 up above, it opens up to the content standards, problem solving, and communicating reasoning. And on the live page, this is also a table of contents. So when we get there, we're going to actually select communicating reasoning, and it's like a table of contents. It'll shoot us down to that part. So then or you can scroll down until you see it, and so then you'll see the characteristics of the communicating reasoning and the assessment targets A through G, and they're defined. And we know in mathematics it's so important, because definitions are such a huge part of how we define the rules and how we navigate within the mathematics. So also on that page, you'll see the descriptor. And so it just gives a brief descriptor. It'll list the assessment targets. Notice that the depth of knowledge, or DOK levels, are already here. And what I love about this is because depth of knowledge is so hard. It really takes, it's something we're always striving towards. It's not finite. There's not like a black and white line on this, right? It's kind of that shade, that area of gray that math now has, where the other content areas have always had that kind of shade of gray or area of gray. I kind of like to explain it with the ELA, or if I write a paper, I might give it to one teacher, they might say, oh, that's an A. Another teacher might say, oh, that's a C, right? It's like, well, how? It's kind of subjective. So depth of knowledge is the same thing, and I like to think of it as a target that we're always striving towards to get more rigorous into our questionings and into our practice. One of the things about the assessment targets is that why those are so important is those are actually the primary targets around communicating reasoning. And as I spoke of before, we take that content and we embed it into that practice. And so it says, notice that 80% of the claim 3 for third grade come from these targets. And what that means is that doesn't say that none of the other standards or none of the other clusters will be about communicating reasoning. These are just the ones that lend themselves more readily. So we'll use those ones more often than some of the other ones. And then we have the achievement level descriptors. The achievement level descriptors are not, they're kind of like a ruler. So we say that a student is if they're a 3, they're proficient, and 4 exceeds proficiency. But this is really when I solicit that evidence from the students through my practice, this is how I will determine if they are a 3 or not. So it's not that I want the students necessarily to do this. This is more like how we're going to measure that. So we're going to go ahead and get out of this document, and we're going to go over to our Iowa Core page. So we would go to iowacore.gov up in our search bar and hit return, and it brings us up to the Iowa Core page through the Iowa Department of Education. We would go over here to Educator Resources. We would scroll down to Mathematics, and then this opens up to Mathematics Resources, and you would scroll down, and under Assessment, we're going to go to Summative. So then we're going to select grade 3. So again, these are where you have the classroom resources that lists all this. And then it opens up to this page. And so up here, these are our content standards. And let's go ahead and differentiate between the M and S. So wherever you see an M, that is a major cluster in the standards or a priority cluster. So those standards can be thought of as priority standards for content or major standards for content. And then S is the supporting. And in the December webinar, I talk about that more in depth. But for this webinar, we're going to go ahead and select up here, communicating reasoning. And so you'll come down here and you see that students can clearly and precisely construct viable arguments. And at this time, I would encourage you to go ahead and pause the recording and read through these targets. Something to keep in mind is that these are the targets that we would use in shaping our instruction and our formative assessment of our students. And why this is so helpful is we don't want to get hung up and say, well, we're communicating reasoning and we're just going to do 3 and 6. So to actually take it to be more rigorous, really what we're going to look for is to hit these targets at these DOK levels. So for example, I want students to use the technique of breaking an argument into different cases. And if I have students doing that, then that's something that supports communicating reasoning, that's something that supports standards for mathematical practices 3 and 6, and that's a depth of knowledge or DOK level 2 and 3. So I really want to shoot for these in my instruction, because then I'm hitting my DOKs, then I'm hitting my standards of mathematical practices. Again, you'll see where it says 80% will come from these, and we'll go and look at this in a minute. And then we have our ruler down here and how we're going to determine proficiency. And this also connects to the standards-based grading rubric that's also on the website. So let's go ahead and take a look at 30AB. So we're going to scroll up to 30AB. So I find 30AB in this cluster or target, which says in target B, or in the standards cluster, understand properties of multiplication and the relationship between multiplication and division. So it works around these two standards here. So I'm going to open that up, and then you have to click again to open up the PDF. And you'll see there's lots of information. Again, this is a table of contents. So we're going to click, and it takes us down to here. So we can look and say, okay, so claim 3, communicating reasoning. Marquis said the more numbers you multiply, the greater the product. Then he wrote 2 times 8 equals 16. 2 times 5 times 5 equals 50. So this is his argument, right? And then he continues to say 2 times 3 times 5 times 2 is 60. And since 60 is greater than 50 and 50 is greater than 16, then I must be right. And so it asks the students to give them an example of a product of two numbers that is greater than 2 times 5 times 5. So you have two brackets. So we're going to think of two numbers that give us a product that's bigger than 50. And they can enter that. And so the student might say 7 and 8, because if I take 7 times 8, it is 56, which is greater than 50. So I just provided a counter example to his argument. So I'm critiquing the reasoning of others. I'm constructing a precise and accurate, clear argument of my own. And so you'll find the claim 3 questions for the different targets when you open these up. So let's just open one up at random and see if we hit. So we opened up target G, and when it opens up, this one does not have any communicating reasoning. It doesn't mean we won't see questions around these standards. It just means it's not a focus for this particular standards for mathematical practices of communicating reasoning. So then the last thing that we want to do is we want to go over here to the effective teaching practices. So these are the 8 effective teaching practices in our principles to action. And at this time in the recording, this would be a good point to pause and read through these. So I would encourage you to do that now. And as you reflect through these, you will see which ones do I have to think about if my students are going to be communicating reasoning. It seems that if I want my students to implement or to communicate reasoning, then I need to implement tasks that promote reasoning. I also probably want them to use and connect mathematical representations, to have mathematical discourse. As the educator or teacher in the room, I need to pose purposeful questions. Support their productive struggle, and elicit and use evidence of student thinking. So it's not all the time that you have to think about all of the practices, but you'll use a good many of them throughout your practice in your classroom. So how does a practice differ from strategy? I often get that question because people say, well, I use this strategy. Well, that's great, but what is your practice? And teachers, we have a practice, or is a craft as some refer to it. And we use many different tools or strategies, but we really want to hone and perfect our practice. The difference between a practice and a strategy, I like to use this analogy. Every evening, my family practices having dinner. That's a common practice that you'll find in our home. The strategies in which we facilitate that practice are different. We might order out, we might order in, we might go out, I might cook something, it might be left overnight. Those are all the different strategies that we use to have dinner. But dinner is the practice. And we all know that if we want to stay healthy, we have to practice having dinner on a regular basis. Maybe we can skip having dinner once in a while, so we can skip that practice, but most of the time we want to have that practice. So this is the end of this webinar, and I encourage you to, as you go through this, pause and reflect. You can go back and rewatch it, and please see me for any questions. And remember, if you are graduating, send me an email other than your school email so that I can stay in touch. And I really want to be able to identify those leaders for the future of our Iowa students. Thanks, everyone.